white line cutting across bright red at 60 miles an hour. Not a logo, not a racing stripe borrowed from a real competition car. A shape somebody drew on a lease stock sedan to make it read on a television screen. That shape is the reason you know what this car looks like before you know its name. Here's what almost nobody knows about it. The man who created this show didn't want this car. The actor who drove it hated it so much he tried to wreck it on purpose. And the thing that made this vehicle one of the most replicated pieces of television history in existence, the stripe, the color, the whole loud, ridiculous look of it, was never supposed to be the point of anything. It was a joke, told at the car's expense by the people standing closest to it. This is the story of the Ford Gran Torino from Starsky and Hutch, and how the thing everyone involved was embarrassed by became the only thing anyone remembers. Every hero car starts as somebody's idea of what the hero should drive. This one didn't. Series creator William Blinn had a picture in his head before a single frame of Starsky and Hutch was shot. Two undercover cops, streetwise and loose, running the case in a green and white Chevrolet Camaro convertible, the kind of car Blinn had owned himself years earlier and never stopped thinking about. It wasn't a studio note, it wasn't a marketing decision. It was personal. Confirmed from Blinn himself in the 2003 documentary Starsky and Hutch and Making of Behind the Badge, he wanted his own car, remade, for two characters who were supposed to feel like an extension of him. That idea didn't survive contact with the production budget. Spelling Goldberg Productions, the company behind the show, had an existing arrangement with Ford's Studio TV car loan program, a deal that supplied vehicles to television productions at a fraction of retail cost in exchange for the exposure. General Motors couldn't accommodate the request for Camaros, and even if they could have, the contract in place meant the detectives were driving a Ford. Not because it fit the characters, not because anyone thought it looked right, because that was the car the budget had already decided on months before casting was finalized, in a conversation that had nothing to do with storytelling at all. This is worth sitting with, because it reframes everything that follows. The Gran Torino wasn't chosen. It was what was left after the thing that was chosen fell through. And the platform itself wasn't a glamorous stock to begin with. The mid-1970s Gran Torino arrived in the middle of what the industry would later call the malaise era, a stretch where American manufacturers, squeezed by emissions regulations, fuel costs, and labor disputes, were cutting corners wherever corners could be cut. Ford moved the Torino to a cheaper frame-on-chassis configuration, a step down from the unibody construction the previous generation had used. Build quality suffered, handling suffered. This was, by any honest measure, an ordinary car built during an unglamorous period for the American auto industry, not a car anyone was clamoring to put at the center of a television series. That was the car handed to the transportation department. Make it work. The job fell to George Grenemere, Spelling Goldberg's transportation coordinator, tasked with pulling something usable out of Ford's available lease stock. He wasn't building a legend, he was solving a logistics problem. Find a car in the fleet that could plausibly read as a police detective's ride on a weekly action series, on a television budget, on a television schedule. What he landed on was a Gran Torino two-door hardtop in Ford's factory bright red. And what he added to it was the thing that would outlive everything else about the show. A wide white vector stripe, sweeping up over the hood, across the roof, down the flanks, outlined in black on the cars built for filming. Underneath the paint, the production made the modifications any stunt vehicle needs. Air shocks in the rear, oversized Anson Sprint 5-slot mag wheels, reverse tires so no brand logo would show on camera, though Firestone markings occasionally slipped through in underside shots anyway. None of this was designed to become iconic. It was designed to be visible. There's a difference, and the show's own star made sure everyone knew it. Half a dozen to roughly a dozen of these Torinos, sources differ on the exact count and no single production ledger has surfaced to settle it, moved through the show's run between 1975 and 1979, split between stunt work, interior shots, and the clean beauty shot cars reserved for close-ups. Stunt versions ran larger 400 or 460 cubic inch V8s with lower gearing for faster acceleration in chase sequences, and carried a handwritten dashboard reminder, "Do not exceed 50 miles per hour," A small, almost comic admission that the car everyone would remember as fast was, underneath the stripe, exactly as compromised as the rest of its generation. A 351 Windsor V8 producing something in the neighborhood of 154 horsepower, paired to a 3-speed automatic. The illusion of speed was doing all the work the engine wasn't. Paul Michael Glaser hated it. Not mild disinterest, active vocal contempt from the first week of production. Aaron Spelling walked him out to the lot to introduce him to his character's car, and Glaser's reaction, by multiple accounts, was immediate. This looked like a huge, bright red tomato. The writers heard him, and instead of burying the complaint, they used it. Striped tomato, Glaser's own insult, delivered off-camera in frustration, got written into the scripts as the show's in-universe nickname for the car. The joke stopped being private. It became the character's name for his own vehicle, spoken on-air in front of the audience the car was supposedly there to impress. Reported but not fully documented in a single primary source, that Glaser's dislike went further than words, that he drove the car harder into curbs and dumpsters than any script called for, hoping, consciously or not, to put it out of commission. The detail shows up across enough independent accounts to treat as more than rumor, even without a studio memo to confirm intent. What's not in dispute is that Glaser thought the car was wrong for the character on a practical level too. That an undercover detective driving something this loud, this recognizable, made no sense as a disguise. He wasn't wrong. He was also outvoted by a paint job. There's a quieter piece of this story that almost never gets told, and it belongs here because it's the clearest proof of what actually landed with audiences and what didn't. Hutch didn't drive a Torino. He drove a battered Ford, a Galaxie, plain, unremarkable, the visual opposite of everything Starsky's car was shouting. It was, by any conventional measure, the more sensible choice for a working undercover cop. Nobody built a tribute to it. Nobody restored one for a car show. For decades, it simply disappeared from public memory, until recently, when a matched pair of Galaxie replicas surfaced for sale in Britain, treated as a novelty footnote rather than the show's actual second hero vehicle. The correct instinct, quiet, plausible, tactically sound, produced nothing anyone wanted to keep. The wrong instinct, loud, impractical, actively mocked by the man driving it, produced the single most recognizable image to come out of the entire series. Say it plainly, because the story doesn't need decoration to land. The thing that made this car immortal was never supposed to be the point. It wasn't a design choice made with confidence. It was a leasing contract, a budget compromise, and a paint job applied to make an unglamorous car legible on a television screen. The person who dreamed up the show wanted a different car entirely. The person who drove it despised it enough to try to break it. The nickname that's now inseparable from the car's identity started as an insult, not a marketing line. And the audience took the joke and kept it. Ford noticed the demand fast enough to act on it before the show had even finished its run, greenlighting a limited production of factory-built replicas for the 1976 model year, somewhere between 1,000 and just over 1,300 units, depending on which record you trust, painted in the same bright red with the same Wimbledon white stripe, minus the black outline that marked the true filming cars. That's not a subtle signal. That's a car manufacturer deciding in real time that a mockery had become a product line. 50 years on, the show itself is a rerun. The car is an institution. Barrett-Jackson has sold collector-grade recreations through its major auctions as recently as 2025, some autographed on the sun visor by the original cast, Glaser included, the same man who once wanted no part of the thing he's now asked to sign. When the character got a second life in the 2004 feature film, one of that production's hero cars sold at auction for more than $50,000. Nobody's doing that for Hutch's Galaxie. The stripe that was supposed to be forgettable outlived the actor's disgust, outlived the budget compromise that created it, outlived the show that aired it. It didn't become iconic because it was designed to be. It became iconic because it was the thing everyone underestimated, including the people who built it. If you're chasing this car today, the first thing to understand is that scarcity and replication are running in opposite directions at the same time, and that tension is exactly what makes authentication the whole game. Of the roughly half dozen to dozen Torinos actually used in production between 1974 and 1976, only 3 are confirmed to survive, a number small enough that any car claiming to be an original screen-used vehicle deserves real scrutiny before real money changes hands. Meanwhile, Ford's own 1976 factory replica run put well over 1,000 near-identical cars into public hands, of which an estimated 100 or so are believed to remain, and on top of that population sits an unknown, uncounted number of home-built tributes assembled from ordinary Gran Torinos over the last 5 decades. 3 real screen cars, a shrinking pool of genuine factory replicas, an open-ended field of amateur builds wearing the same paint scheme. That's why serious buyers and collectors lean on documentation instead of appearance. A Marty report, the factory build sheet system used to verify original Ford specifications, can confirm whether a given 1976 Torino left the factory configured as a genuine striped tomato special edition, tracing DSO codes and VIN data back to the original order. It won't tell you whether a car was used on camera. That provenance runs through production paperwork, prior ownership chains, and increasingly the kind of expert authentication groups like the International Movie and TV Vehicle Owners Association specialize in. The visual cues matter too. Genuine factory replicas skip the black stripe outline, the air shocks, and the slotted wheels that the actual filming cars carried, which means a too accurate car built to full screen spec is very likely a modern recreation, not a factory original, however good the paint looks. For anyone building rather than buying, the mechanical foundation is forgiving and well-documented. 351 Windsor and 400 or 460 cubic inch V8 options, 3-speed automatic transmissions, parts that remain reasonably available through the broader Torino and Ford full-size platform community even now. The stripe itself, the vector pattern, is reproducible with the right template and enough patience. What's not reproducible is the thing that made the original matter in the first place, the accident of it. The fact that nobody meant for this to become anything. Somewhere in a Ford design meeting in the mid-1970s, nobody stood up and said, "This stripe is going to outlast the show, the studio, and most of the people in this room." Nobody could have. It wasn't built with that kind of confidence. It was built to solve a Tuesday problem, make an ordinary car look like it belonged on television by a transportation coordinator working with what the lease fleet happened to have. The car still gets signed on auction stages by the actor who once called it a tomato as an insult. The show ended in 1979. The stripe never did.